Joseph felt the mountain tremble all around him. He reached deeper and deeper into the stone, his sonorous voice calling out to the rock, willing it to fall. All around him was death. He watched as one by one the soldiers whom he'd led here were cut down by either vicious blade or fell tooth and claw. Either way, their screams tore at him and threatened to drown out his stone song. "Why do you fight it, Joseph?" The voice of the void cut through his thoughts, causing his song to stutter and almost falter. "Do you really think your pathetic little archway can hold us back? Are you really that vain that you think you could stop what I have put in motion?" The voice laughed, and Joseph found his gut twisting inside him. He increased the tempo of his music, his gruff voice calling out in the language of the mountain, pleading with it to end the nightmare. The rocks were slow to respond, as if Joseph called to them from across a great chasm and they were too tired to heed his call. With a sharp intake of breath, Joseph realized what was happening. The mountain, his beloved home, was dying. Its sluggish reaction was because it was losing strength. The rift was swallowing the very essence of the granite around him. Everything was dying as the nightmares began to pour out of the swirling vortex. "Do you finally see? You were doomed long before this day. There was nothing you could have done to prevent this." The voice cooed soothingly, and Joseph felt a hand caress his cheek. He turned to follow the sensation, and his voice staggered to a halt as the breath left his chest in a whoosh. Shirka stood before him, her face a twisted mask that smiled crookedly. Her eyes were now dark rings of black with pinpricks of red at their centers which glowed. Her smile broadened as Joseph took a step backwards, his eyes widening in fear. "Yikanu," he began, but the horrible visage of Shirka blinked and shook her head. "I most certainly can." With that, her hand shot forward, becoming a tendril of dark mist, and Joseph felt something slam into his chest, causing him to grunt in pain. He looked down to see a deep purple shard of crystal piercing his sternum. He opened his mouth to speak, but it filled with blood too fast, and he began to choke. The cave around him began to darken, and he found himself sliding to his knees. "This is the reward I promised." Shirka's doppelganger knelt down before him, her brows raised in concern, and she shushed him gently as he struggled against her embrace. She pulled him into her arms and held him gently as his vision began to fade. "A quick death and a rest from your mortality. Do not fear oblivion, for I have conquered it and shall find you there. Now hush." She stroked Joseph's cheek gently, her twisted mouth never ceasing its macabre grin. "You go and rest while I get things ready for you." Joseph tried to scream, but only managed a weak cough before his eyes closed. He was so very tired. The creature wearing Shirka's face tilted her head as Joseph's last breath escaped his lips. Then she stood and cast his broken corpse away from her. She looked around the cavern, taking in the glorious violence that was ebbing away as the last of Caligdrum's defenders slipped away into their rest. All about her shadows of beings which had long forgotten their original forms, or even what rules of reality bound these mortals to this world, scuttled and scurried throughout the corpses. Some began to take shapes that resembled insects and crawled into the open mouths of corpses, causing the bodies to writhe with an unnatural energy before rising up with painful groans to shamble forward on broken limbs. Other creatures hurried to find crystals, ingesting the glowing geodes and shaping the reality around them to their will. Those who had missed their physical strength formed their incorporeal forms into great hulking brutes who wielded large blades in their muscled hands. Still others who yearned for power over the elements, and some who remembered vaguely the song that Joseph had sung to the stone, began gathering their energies to form creatures with large mouths and stretched vocal cords so that they could make horrifying parodies of the stone priest's cantos to the rocks. Shirka's dead eyes gazed around, taking in the beauty of creation happening all around her. Some distant part of her that she had long forgotten reviled at the scene, screaming out unfamiliar words such as abominations, horrors, unnatural. But these labels were meaningless in her present consciousness. She stood and allowed one of the skittering shadow insects to crawl into her open hand. The creature had tried to take the form of a strange beetle, but had gotten proportions wrong, and its legs were of different and varying lengths, some freakishly long, while others barely reached the ground from its body. She smiled and stroked its carapace lovingly. "At last we are free," she sighed. "Go to, little one, and spread the word. We come to remind the world that we are, that we exist, and that we are nothing no more. Go to, and prepare the way." She lifted her hand, and the insect flew off ahead of her. Soon it was joined by others of its ilk, and the cavern was alive with the clickings and slithering noises that caused her skin to crawl. She relished the feeling. As she turned back to the others, she felt a different sensation, one that she could not define at first, but that gradually grew until it possessed her every thought. It was a desire. She could recognize that much, her mind plumbing the depths of her memory as she sought to label it. The desire grew stronger as she searched, becoming so strong that she could barely focus on anything else. She frowned as another emotion began to war for her attention. This one she readily identified as anger. But anger towards what? The desire grew within her, overwhelming everything else in its screaming demand to be met. She knew that the other mortal creatures who lived far above under the living sun could sate her desire, her growing need to silence the urgings within her. She directed her minions towards those poor souls above. At last she found a label which best suited it, though it was a pale and limiting one that could not hold the driving urgency which accompanied it. A single word fluttered up from her memory, and she latched onto it, willing it into the lesser shadows around her. Hunger. She screamed.